So I'd like to invite on stage a person of great experience, and we were talking about finance, and she will tell us a bit more about that. She has a great experience in art and heritage for 30 years. She was head of the World Monument Fund, a private international nonprofit organization dedicated to the preservation of historic architecture and cultural heritage sites. Today, she leads the Cultural Heritage Finance Alliance, created in 2019 to promote collaborative and innovative financing solutions for preserving heritage. Please welcome Bonnie Burnham. Maybe we can sit there, yeah? Well, thank you so much for being here, and I wanted to start, as you started your career in the 1970s, I would say, if I'm correct, in the United States. Do you remember the first time that maybe you connected environmental impact and social impact with heritage in art?
Well, I think my first awareness really of art, because I grew up in a very rural environment in the southern United States, was a quest to understand the architecture of the place where I grew up and what it meant. And that information wasn't really readily available in the education system where I grew up, and it didn't seem to be important to people really in the community. And so I was kind of a preservationist from the beginning, a lifelong preservationist without even knowing necessarily what it meant. But I was fortunate enough during my graduate studies in Paris at the Sorbonne to receive an assignment from the International Council on Museums to work on a study of cultural property protection in all the countries of the world and how it worked, particularly in relation to museum acquisition of antiquities in traffic in illicit art. And that led to a lifelong pursuit and a thorough understanding. This was the time when the UNESCO conventions on illicit traffic and the World Heritage Convention were being developed and rolled out. UNESCO was organizing big campaigns hoping to engage international governments in this cause. Some of them were quite successful and some of them were complete failures. And they'd roll out the call for financing, and they would just get no response. And so they realized, and that's when the World Heritage Convention more or less came out of that moment. So it was a very exciting moment to be part of. And it gave me a great sense of how the legal and administrative and political frameworks for the protection of cultural heritage were being established. But although there were references to the private sector and to going beyond governmental funding and intergovernmental funding, there really wasn't a mechanism for that. And so 15 years later, I found myself as the head of the World Monuments Fund. I thought, here I can really make a difference, because we don't have huge amounts of money, but we can use it in a catalytic way to try to bring about positive change through casting the first stone, let's say.
Yeah, well, maybe if we come back to this 30 years of experience at the World Monument Fund, maybe on some learnings that you have, or if you have specific anecdotes, maybe in this long career that you had in this organization that made a strong impression, or I don't know, or maybe made you felt unsettled at one point, but something that, yeah, the learnings that you take away from this experience.
Well, there's one particular project that I like to talk about because it was one of the first choices that I made as the director of the organization that had been in existence already for about 20 years and had been largely focused on the aftermath of the Venice flood and other, which stimulated a huge amount of private sector interest and participation around the world, but was entirely non-governmental and not really working within the framework that I knew. And it was a church in the south of France, the Church of Saint-Trophime, which is in the heart of the city of Arles. And I think there might be a picture available. But it's a beautiful Romanesque church. At the time that I visited Arles in the middle 80s, when I first became the head of the World Monuments Fund, it was absolutely black. It was completely covered with the evidence of air pollution in the city, and it was a huge conundrum. They didn't really know what to do and how to bring it back to some kind of appropriate state. And I felt like with our catalytic funding, we might be able to help simply by helping them develop a methodology for conservation. And the results were really quite spectacular. The church not only looks really beautiful today, but a lot of the key artistic features that it was feared might have been lost as a result of this air pollution were actually in beautiful condition underneath a heavy crust of black soot. But it also had such a huge impact on the community and on the mentality of the city. And they discovered in the course of the conservation treatment that the cause of the pollution was actually cars stopping in front of the church at a stop sign on the corner. And when they would start again, the exhaust from the cars would essentially be plastered on the facade. And so the mayor of the city began to think about what that meant for the community itself and decided to close the whole inner part of the city to traffic. And this was such a radical decision, and would have, had it not been for the restoration of the church, they never would have considered that kind of thing to be possible. And so it completely transformed the urban environment. And that's what made me realize that a gesture of this kind can have meaning so far beyond the actual intention and the investment that those were the kinds of opportunities we were looking for.
Yeah, it's also a question of, and I think it's super interesting that how you bring our heritage, which are vestige of the past, we are a trace of our history, into the now, into our time, and how do you do that without erasing the past?
Well, I think the whole perception of the purpose of heritage preservation has changed dramatically in the time that I've been working in this field. It was very much driven by aesthetics. 25, 30 years ago, when I was a young person working in the field, my choice of that church as an initial project was absolutely based on its aesthetic value and its importance. And it was only, for me, it was a revelation of how much impact you can bring about through a public gesture in relation to preserving culture. But today, the values have shifted and perhaps expanded in terms of what people understand and what people expect in relation to things that happen in a public environment and the kinds of things that both the public sector and private finance will put resources into. And it has to have humanitarian impact. I was interested in, on the last panel, the humanitarian panel talking about libraries and knowledge and how much the idea of serving the community has changed. And community voices were not very strong. A couple of decades ago, people didn't really feel it was up to them to try to influence public decision making, whereas now I think public decision making is really focused on what people want, much more so. And the financial sector, and in particular impact investment sector, is following those messages from the community and trying to design programs that really have meaning across the spectrum. And this needs to happen in the cultural sector, and particularly in heritage preservation, in a way that it hasn't so far.
In 2019, you decided to co-create, because you're not alone on this adventure, but co-founded the international organization called the Cultural Heritage Finance Alliance. So sorry. Why did you decide to create this new organization? What was the need of the launch of this new alliance?
Well, it was really an outgrowth of this thinking. We call it CHIFA, Cultural Heritage Finance Alliance. The whole cultural sector, as it's searching for funds, and at the World Monuments Fund, particularly as we embraced more and more projects from all over the world, so many people would come to us looking for resources, and what we could offer was so much more limited than what was really needed, that I felt that something had to be done to reach into capital investment and other pools of funding other than the traditional ones of government and philanthropy. And so that's what this organization is about. And it was a real lesson trying to even communicate with people in the world of finance. If you've spent your whole life in the cultural sector, is kind of a different language that has to be learned, but the financial world talks about a capital stack. And it's about layers of funding coming from different sources and how they can be used to intersect and kind of enhance each other. But the culture doesn't rely on much more than governmental and philanthropic funding. So what we're trying to do is create a resource that helps local advocates design projects that can be marketable and that will generate long-term resources and be economically sustainable over time. And these can be urban projects, they can be rural projects, they can involve individual buildings, but the outcome is really meant to be economic sustainability. Many of the cultural projects that you see that people are raising funds for, their ultimate goal is to do the project. And that doesn't necessarily guarantee sustainability.
Maybe can we take a concrete example? I know that you are coming back from Tunis where you were working on one project, but there are other projects around the world that you're working on. Maybe to better understand what CHIFA is doing, like a specific example.
So I brought a couple of pictures with me from Tunis from a couple of days ago. It's a city that's, we're talking about the Medina, which is the inner part of the city of Tunis. It has a very ancient history dating back to about the 7th century. It's a large area of about 300 hectares, inhabited by about 100,000 people, and very vibrant with souks and a whole historic way of life. It's very unique. It's a World Heritage. Medina is a World Heritage Site. But a lot of that is in decline. Not only the individual buildings like the one that's on the screen here, but the traditions of artisanship that have been the lifeblood of the Medina over time are being not really being sustained and passed on to next generation, and to some degree supplemented in the marketplace by goods, cheap merchandise that comes from elsewhere. So it's a kind of conundrum that you find in historic cities, and particularly across the developing world. But decline in historic centers is an issue that we've struggled with in the West as well over the last 50 years or so. And so our efforts are focused on trying to cover that gap between what the cultural sector and what the local communities can do with their own resources and what they really need in order to achieve sustainability. This is a beautiful building. There are many this was a former church, but there are many palaces in the Medina that were richly decorated over time. They're now more or less up for reuse. This project was sponsored, it's an exhibition space sponsored by the Italian government, only recently finished, at a cost of about $12 million in foreign aid funding. But as you can see, there wasn't any provision whatsoever for long-term use of this facility. And so when I visited it the other day with a couple of colleagues, there wasn't anyone else there. And I think that's a conundrum that cultural institutions have. The building is part of a larger complex, and these are some other buildings in the complex, that was once known as the consular quarter, because each foreign country working with the Tunisian government had a house here where they would, where not only the consular personnel would live, but they would host people from their countries who were visiting. They might be artists or writers, or they might be tradesmen who had goods that they would store in those archways. The one on the left is the French consular house, or fonduc is the architectural style, and the one on the right is the German house. And the one that you saw before, the former church, was the Italian consular house. So there's a great opportunity to regenerate a sense of the internationalism of this place, its connection to the rest of the world through this neighborhood, and it's entirely abandoned and kind of off limits. Nobody, when the country achieved independence, none of these countries kept these consulates up. They moved their embassies out of town, and they simply turned them over to the municipality, and that was the end of that. And so I think this is another opportunity waiting to happen, but it needs careful integration between governmental sources and local ones. There happens to be a local organization now investing in the Medina, which is kind of a unique opportunity. This kind of thing doesn't exist in very many places. And so there seems to be, for us, the opportunity to make that demonstration by planning to cover that gap and reach sustainability through investment in the reinvestment in the cultural life, the people who live in the buildings, and the trades that they represent, so that in fact, these fonducs will recover the life that they were built for originally, maybe 200 years ago.
And bringing back people to the Medina with a new way of seeing the architecture they used to see before. I think there is 4 pillars in the Shifa, is like environment, economy,
right.
yeah, funding, and
well, yes. The cities of the world that have these kinds of resources, many of them belong to something called the Organization of World Heritage Cities, and they have formulated a platform that they're encouraging not only their own members, but cities around the world to adopt. It has to do with housing, mobility, green space, and the idea of economic regeneration that incorporates all these elements into a common platform that can invite the opportunity of private investment to come in and find its own place in the framework. There's been traditionally a lot of skepticism and certain distancing between the governmental sector and the private sector. Sometimes it's really hard to bridge these gaps. There are so many, if the government doesn't have resources, doesn't have money, they have a tendency to make rules instead, and just the only way they can really carry out their responsibility of stewardship is by making stronger protections, and that sometimes results in obstacles. So breaking up those log jams is, I think a lot of people have realized this is where the future lies in terms of reintegrating the historic urban environment into future planning. That's what we're trying to do.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, for being on stage with me and for sharing the project and the...
I have some material if anyone's interested. This is my colleague, Keith Wright, and he'll give you one of these.
Yeah, if anyone wants to speak to Bonnie afterwards. Thank you very much for the audience for being here as well. I think you've understand that we are convinced on this session, that art is not only a tool, it's a must-have for social impact and environmental impact. Thank you so much. Enjoy your time at ChangeNOW, and yes, see you soon.